everyone. Brian Berlatic, welcome back to the mother of all talk shows. I wanted to take your counsel, your expertise about where the land lies now, where the battlefield lies now, and what we might expect to happen next.
First of all, it's always an honor and a pleasure to come on. Thank you so much for having me. In regards to the situation on the ground in Ukraine, we have a lot of Western analysts claiming that Russia is engaged in what they claimed was going to be their winter offensive. But I have not heard any Russian military or political leader say that they were launching some major offensive. What I see instead is Russia putting pressure all along the line of contact on Ukrainian forces, in a way spoiling preparations by Ukraine to launch their offensive. And that is something that Ukraine has talked about. They've talked of nothing else but this spring offensive they have planned. And then, of course, Russian forces, the Wagner group, they are encircling Bakhmut, and Ukraine has invested heavily in trying to hold that city, and they are failing. And now it looks like they're beginning some sort of withdrawal. Of course, we cannot make any sort of prediction of how long that's going to take, because there's a lot of factors, including how well Russian defenses, as they close the encirclements, how well they can weather any sort of counter attack by Ukrainian forces.
I was going to ask you about Bakhmut. Everything moves much more slowly in this war. This is not the six-day war by any means, launched by Israel against its Arab neighbors. This is a war of attrition now, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, Russian military leaders, they have been talking about how the entire concept of what they're doing on the battlefield right now is to inflict attritional losses on Ukrainian forces. The whole point of putting pressure on Bakhmut and beginning to encircle it was to deliberately draw in as many Ukrainian forces and as much of their equipment as possible. And because of the political corner the United States and their proxies in Kiev have painted themselves into, they are obligated to do this for optics, and it is working in Russia's advantage. I was just reading a Wall Street Journal article right before I came on, talking about how the losses for Ukraine are so significant, it might actually spoil their spring offensive, which I believe is Russia's goal here.
500,000 casualties seems to be emerging as the consensus. 250,000 dead Ukrainians and 250,000 maimed and wounded and crippled, in many cases forever. This is First World War level of losses, Brian, isn't it?
These are huge losses, and the unfortunate part is this is a proxy war being waged by the United States against Russia, and who is paying the cost for this proxy war? It is Ukraine. They're paying for it in blood. They're paying for it in the destruction of their infrastructure, and the United States is not paying anything at all. As a matter of fact, they're profiting from it, especially the arms industry, handsomely. And so there's no incentive for them to begin any sort of negotiation or stop this. And ideally, it would have been best if this never started at all.
Indeed so. We'd have to say, I certainly have no hesitation in saying, the Ukrainians have fought very bravely in this war. One might have expected, given the caliber of their political leadership, the ramshackle nature of their polity, their state, the ragbag of far-right and ultra-right nationalists and even Nazis in their ranks. You would not have expected them to stand up to the Russians so bravely and for so long. So let me ask you that question. Do you acknowledge that point I've just made?
I agree with that. I also believe it's a result of how Russia went about its special military operation. They could have assembled many more troops before they began. They could have went in much more forcefully. They only began dismantling, say, the power grid relatively recently. These were all things they could have done immediately, as the United States would usually do when invading another country. And so I think it is a combination of, the Ukrainians were already on a war footing. They had been fighting in the Donbas region for 8 years. And between that and all of the weapons that NATO flooded into Ukraine, and then also because of the way Russia began the special military operation, I think these are all contributing factors to why both sides are fighting so fiercely now.
Now, if Ukraine mounts a spring counter-offensive, presumably that would be aimed at Crimea. Is Russia well placed to resist that?
It's hard to tell unless we know the disposition of troops on both sides. That's always a question, so we have to keep that in mind. But what I will say is that Ukraine, under much more ideal circumstances, launched their Kharkov and Kherson offensives, and Russia was able to blunt and then eventually stop both of those. They have mobilized since then. They have mobilized 300,000 additional troops, and they've created extensive defensive works in these areas. They are anticipating this spring offensive. I would say that Russia is in a much better position to slow down and then stop any Ukrainian offensive. And I believe the losses on Ukraine's side will be extremely severe. And then again, as I've said many times before, Russia, their goal is to demilitarize Ukraine. It's not to hold on to territory. They will give up territory temporarily to preserve their manpower, their equipment, because they know that if the Ukrainian army eventually falls apart, it doesn't matter how much territory they took in their offensive, Russia will be able to get it back. And we're actually already starting to see that happen around Crimea. The Russian forces are pushing back into territory that Ukraine took during their Kharkov offensive.
Given that the United States is paying no price, indeed, as you say, is profiting from the sacrifice on the battlefield of so many Ukrainians, and given that Zelensky will, let's face it, will not be running for president again, he's very unlikely to even see out his presidential term. He's more likely to end up in exile, very well upholstered exile, in one of his many palatial homes purchased in the very short time that he's been the president of Ukraine. And so nobody pays a political price for continuing to fight the war, is the point I'm making. There are no votes to be lost, only lives to be lost. And so you wonder, and I have wondered for a while, when the military officers, perhaps not the top brass, they may be as corrupted as the politicians, but junior officers say enough, no further. What do you think about that, Brian?
It's something that I hope for. I think a lot of people hope for, just to end this senseless proxy war. It's not really being fought in the best interests of Ukraine. As a matter of fact, again, at the expense of Ukraine's best interests. But unfortunately, for as long as Ukraine has a unified command structure, something like that is very difficult to develop in the middle of an armed conflict. I think it's very unlikely. I think something like that might start to happen as Ukraine's fighting capacity in general begins to collapse, degrade much more significantly than we've seen so far. Something like that is a possibility, but I wouldn't count on it.
Now, I was listening to Donald Trump in the early hours of the morning. If we park for a moment his unhinged attitude to China and concentrate on his attitude towards this war in Ukraine, he went further last night than he ever has, and he's been going quite far. His critique of the war is utterly damning. Absolutely correct in my view, but utterly damning. Not just, of course, of the Democrats who are in government, but the top Republicans that are effectively funding it and supporting it. Do you think that Trump will find an echo in the United States for these criticisms?
I think there is a growing segment of the Western public in general, and also the United States, who are frustrated with this and many other wars and proxy wars that the US either already has going or is planning. You just mentioned China, that's where all of this is heading next. So I think so. He says a lot of things like that, which is why people vote for him. But then, unfortunately, last time he was in office, he surrounded himself with the very people who were engineering and executing these wars and proxy wars. So it's sometimes the right rhetoric, but again, it has a life of its own, and I don't think that elections, anyone getting into the White House is going to change it at this point. There's this continuity of agenda that we've seen for years and years in terms of US foreign policy, and unfortunately, I think that's going to continue.
Well, one of the most salient facts of the last 12 months has been the success of American policy in subjugating Europe. Little soldier Schulz, the German chancellor or pretender, was utterly humiliated by Joe Biden. And that's quite an achievement, because Joe Biden can't bite his nails, as we say in Scotland, but he was able to there he is there on the front cover. Look at that. How damning is that front page of little Schulz with his rather cool looking grandfather. The success of having bent Europe to its will, you can't take that away from Joe Biden, really, if you're looking at it purely from short-term American interest, Brian.
I agree with that. We have to remember, this is the US waging a proxy war against Russia. The goal here is to weaken Russia, undermine it, divide and destroy it. But also at the same time, the US seeks hegemony over all allies and adversaries alike. It was never in the cards for Europe to have any sort of independent foreign or domestic policy. It was always meant for the US to dominate Europe as well as Russia. And then this extends to Asia as well. They don't want to see any nation with an independent, self-reliant foreign policy. And I think they've demonstrated that. If Ukraine is this proxy they're waging this war with, I believe it extends to all of Europe. Europe is also a US proxy, and we can see leadership in Europe, if you could call it leadership, making decisions that favor Washington at the expense of European nations and the people living there.
German industry itself, and soon the blue-collar workers that operate it, will all be relocating to the United States. Biden officially offered to take German heavy industry, chemical industry, and so on to the United States, where it will have a more stable energy supply, says the man who blew up Germany's previously very stable energy supply.
It's very obvious what they're doing. They're eating their allies, and then eventually they're going to turn inward and begin eating themselves. This is a cycle that we've watched empires do all throughout history, and we see the United States going down this same unfortunate path. They did not want Europe to have any sort of constructive relationship with Russia, because they wanted to encircle and contain Russia itself. And so they've cut all of these ties between Europe and Russia. They're left with the only option is getting much more expensive energy from the United States. And that will be indefinitely. That will never be as cheap as Russian energy was. And so, yes, the industry is going to have to move to the United States. But I don't think that that is sustainable, and I don't think that Europe is going to recover as long as this is the arrangement and America has this influence over Europe. I think Europe is going to suffer.
Lastly, Brian, I'm always grateful for your wisdom. The US tried to scare people that there was an imminent transfer of weaponry from China to Russia. In other words, China dropping any pretense of being in any way neutral in the conflict. That didn't come to pass. Why?
Well, it's hard to tell. You couldn't blame China for wanting to support Russia because the United States has made it very obvious that China is next. They are going to be the next target. And everything that the US has done to Russia, they're also going to do to China. But we've been watching Russia. They have a very significant military industrial capacity. It seems to be doing much better than the combined military industrial capacity of the West. They have a head start. Maybe they don't even really need that type of support. China, India, many other nations around the world are supporting Russia in other crucial ways, helping them circumvent these sanctions that the US is targeting, or the US and the EU are targeting Russia with. So maybe they really don't even need that type of support.
Brian Belichick, always a pleasure to hear from you. Thanks very much for joining us on the Mother of All Talk Shows.